And now, your feature presentation.
Welcome back to another Untitled movie review. I am one of your hosts, Matt Rorabeck. Alongside, he's allergic to tomatoes, but he is tomato meter approved, Eric Marchen.
Matt, I'm in need of a vacation, man. I
Yeah.
need to get out of there, and I think most people are feeling that way right now. With having spent almost 2 years, cooped up inside. The one relief that we have, in terms of escapist entertainment,
Is
uh,
John Cena.
is John Cena, and also the movies. Speaking of John Cena in reference to F9. And today we have a film that I feel basically encapsulates everything that is completely dated with comedies, especially when you have a script that's been kicking around since like
God,
2005, right?
yeah.
Like even earlier than that, where like it feels like a premise that would have been maybe a little bit more popular if it came out in the era of Wedding Crashers and The 40-Year-Old Virgin.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you there. Yeah, today we are reviewing Clay Tarver's Vacation Friends, starring John Cena, Lil Rel Howery, Yvonne Orji,
Yep.
Meredith Hagner, Robert Wisdom, and more. It is going to be released on Hulu in the United States and Disney Star Plus in Canada, and where Star Plus is available. So it is a streaming film, a former 20th Century Studios picture that was originally, I assume, a theatrical film that once the Disney takeover happened, they decided to put on streaming. And it's, I think, the right place for it. I don't mean that as an insult to all streaming movies, because obviously we've gotten some good ones.
You just
but
mean this is an insult to the film specifically.
a little bit. Like, I mean, it's again, I think I don't maybe dislike it as much as you do. I think it's mostly fine, but kind of I'm indifferent to it, with a few laughs scattered here and there with some random sight gags. But it does, streaming feels like the right spot for this movie. Like, I'm not offended that if you were on Hulu or Star Plus that you'd be like, I'm gonna throw on this John Cena, Lil Rel Howery like comedy, and then you're kind of like, oh, I laughed a few times, and then you forget about it. But that being said, it should be like 81 minutes instead of 103.
I think you literally just summed up the whole film perfectly and how
Yeah,
I even feel about it. Like, I'm not offended by the movie per
sure.
se. It's just that I think it overstays its welcome, and it
Yeah,
just kind of feels really dated. And you can tell that the script, which, has, I think, five, credited writers on there.
it is 5 writers. Yeah, Tom Mullen, Tim Mullen,
So
Clay Tarver, Jonathan Goldstein, and John Francis Daly.
Yeah, so Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daly are a writing duo who are also responsible for writing and directing the reboot of National Lampoon's Vacation with Ed Helms, which was also
Spider-Man Homecoming
yeah
as
they
well.
but they were one of like 7 writers on that. The Ed Helms Vacation movie is also one of the worst comedies in recent memories, even worse than this. So I think that
Yeah,
there's a theme
just
here.
forgettable.
Just maybe not write or direct anything that has the word vacation in it. Uh, and,
They did direct Game Night, which wasn't horrible.
no.
but
Game Night is
but they didn't write that.
Game Night is a very fun film, and obviously, like, the takeaway from that is like, okay, what if David Fincher directed a comedy? But with Vacation Friends, what you have here is a concept that is, again, out of the early 2000s, and it's essentially a buddy comedy that has that kind of same quality of the snob and slob working together, and then also kind of bonding over the course of the period of the film. You think of something like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, or even What About Bob, are the 2 films that I kept thinking about
Yeah.
while watching this, where you have Lil Rel Howery and Yvonne Orji, who play a couple that are on vacation in Mexico as the film begins, and everything is prearranged and planned. Lil Rel Howery's Marcus is planning to propose to Orji's Emily, and as comedies usually go, something goes awry.
Hijinks ensue.
Hijinks ensue as soon as another vacationing couple played by John Cena, who plays Ron, I think, which is one of the funniest things about the movie is that Ron Cena is playing
Ron.
a guy named Ron.
Ron
and,
Cena.
Yeah, and Meredith Hagner playing Kayla, and sort of them being a more free spirit. Kyla, pardon me, playing a more free-spirited, daring couple that are adventurous and throw sort of the rules out of the window, and sort of that coupling of those two pairs becomes a kind of week that they'll never forget, but also a very exhausting one. And you brought up a really good point while we were watching the film, that this sort of vacation montage that you have of, them partying and drinking and getting high
in different
and
Mexican cities, and
almost feels like it takes place over the course of a day, because as the story begins, Lil Rel Howery has this proposal planned, and as soon as they get to their 5-star resort, everything goes awry, and the place that they were going to stay is completely flooded by a jacuzzi,
and then there are no more rooms.
And you think almost like, okay, well, since basically John Cena and Meredith Hagner have invited them into their presidential suite, you think it's almost more like a send-off, like they're just gonna leave because all the other...
Well, he even says that we'll stay one night.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And then it goes into this montage that shows you these different cities that they're partying and drinking and doing drugs in, and I'm like, wow, they covered a lot of ground in one night. And then the film doesn't do a good job at letting you know, oh no, that was an entire week. But then you made it also a good point to throw it back to you, of saying like, well, sometimes when you're on a bender like that kind of thing, like
a week feels like a day, like time goes out the window, like you just completely are in,
and you just wake up at the end
moment.
of it.
Yeah, and you don't know what's up from down, and that also adds to some complications that kind of further add to setting up certain payoffs later on. But I think
but the vacation is a prologue essentially.
Yeah.
And the majority of the movie takes place at the wedding of Emily, of Marcus and Emily.
Yeah. And what is also interesting about that prologue is it also establishes a kind of strange tone with these sight gags that are the way that they're shot, and the way that they use sort of almost establishing shots to convey the punchline of the joke.
Yeah.
And there's also this weird...
Well, the punchline I think are usually like a smash cut, where like the setup is weirdly like these weird kind of, like you said, establishing sight gags or weird digital zooms and different things like that.
Yeah, and again, like I think we'll talk more about the digital zoom as we move along, but I think that is also referencing both Oliver Stone's JFK, and there is an episode of Seinfeld that does, like, anybody who watched Seinfeld will remember there's an episode where both Kramer and Newman get hit by this loogie, and they do this weird kind of flashback and almost like archival footage-esque sort of style, where like the camera zooms in on where the loogie is coming from, like where the shooter is coming from, and that almost feels a little bit similar to a Final Destination, Rube Goldberg kind of sort of a
series of unfortunate events
that lead to not only a sight gag, but also a Chekhov's gun payoff, where in that prologue, one of John Cena plays a park ranger who, like, one of his sort of talents, I guess it would be a party trick or a novelty, is that he can tell when birds are going to crap. And it's like, it's the weirdest sort of reference to have and pay off later on in the movie.
And that's what the movie kind of is. It's just kind of a series of weird payoffs and weird sight gags that like often miss and don't really land, but like the odd time you will get like
they do land, but they just
laugh.
go splat.
Yeah, I mean, but there are the odd thing, like they crash a boat earlier in the movie that is a funny, like that's one of the first sight gags in the movie that I kind of laughed at because it was weird. But then, like you brought up earlier, and I already kind of mentioned, is that it just kind of overstays its welcome. Where I think by the time that prologue ends and they're that you move on to this wedding, and everything obviously comes back from what they did on that trip, but like you just kind of, it loses steam. And I feel like, you know, when we talked about how well John Cena was used in the Suicide Squad, which we reviewed, which you guys can check out on this channel on podcast services, that was pre-video Untitled movie reviews. We talked about how well John Cena was used in that film and how poorly he's used in F9. And then here, I think it kind of falls somewhere in the middle where it's obviously more pure comedy, but it's still that John Cena that I feel like is struggling as an actor. And you can tell that like he's trying really, really hard to either, you know, you said he's played against type. You know, he's supposed to be this loose kind of wild man in this movie when everyone knows John Cena as this kind of, you know, WWE company man. But I don't know, like he doesn't really kind of work. I like Lil Rel Howery. I
Who
like,
even he's struggling, I think, a little bit because
yeah,
he's playing the lead, but also the straight man in kind of this quartet of characters where, you know, he wants everything to go as planned because he also wants to impress his future father-in-laws, played by Robert Wisdom of The Wire and Supernatural, and also has a very infamous sex scene in Todd Solondz's storytelling with
okay.
Selma Blair, where if people who have seen that movie will know what I'm talking about. And it's kind of funny to see like how that character, who is a former Green Beret, bonds with John Cena's Ron, who's also a Green Beret. And then again, like that's kind of playing up into the you know, what about Bob kind of scenario, where I feel Lil Rel Howery is more on the Richard Dreyfuss side of things, even though he's not completely, you know, accepted by Emily's more elitist parents, and especially with, you know, his backstory of being you know, in a previous relationship and being divorced, and also being you know, owning a construction working company and being the boss of that, but again being looked down upon by Emily's family as somebody
Because
that
it's
is blue
construction
collar
work. Yeah.
worker type and not even the owner. They always refer to him as a construction worker. So you kind of know where the beats are of this plot and where it's all going. And
Oh
again,
yeah.
like it feels like some of it has obviously been updated to be modern, but it also feels like some of it has been smoothed over, where you think like, oh, is this going to go into some like gay panic humor or something like that? And it never goes there. Which is good. It chooses to go into a more wacky kind of setup or scenario for the characters, but I almost wish they kind of restructured this whole thing, where it just kind of feels like they went in and just did some touch-ups on the script over the years to keep it a
Yeah.
little bit fresh or modern in terms of being with the times, even though it is very dated in its humor, especially when it comes to the sort of sight gags, but also just the awkward sort of delivery of, you know, situations being told by, you know, these characters, especially with the like the
Yeah.
Mexico stuff, and like, you know, we got to keep Mexico quiet. And again, there's this other weird revelation that's kind of simmering underneath the surface, where there's something I think there that's worth exploring, and the movie never has the guts or ambition to do so, especially once the reveal is made of what happens on this sort of wild night where Little Rel is kind of
Yeah.
sweating a little bit. And I think that where it goes, it's like, okay, like this is kind of interesting, and maybe add some complications or sort of a wrinkle in one of the characters and developing them as you know, three-dimensional individual. But then they kind of just leave it as more of just like, you know, a relief for Little Rel Howery's character overall, and that's kind of boring. And I think
Yeah, and even then with the revelation, like I mean, or not the revelation, but like the movie could have touched upon, you know, uptight people and loosening up and just being a little bit more of a free spirit and kind of not taking your life too seriously or focusing on work and all this kind of stuff. But it kind of just uses that as, you know, um a beginning entry point to why these two couples don't work together. And I don't think it really kind of dives deep into that of loosening up and letting your anxieties go and just kind of learning from one another. Like I don't think the movie really, like, it sort of does by the end, but
but
I
it's
feel
so
like
inconsistent as well,
yeah.
because there are times where, you know, the party crashers of this situation are more accepted by Emily's family and embraced by Emily's family, but then there are other moments where they are still sort of considered to be, outsiders. And then
With
it
the
just
Waffle House conversation at the
yeah,
spa and
yeah, and
like
it just kind of feels like, again, it's tonally inconsistent with the characters
how
and
it's
the
treating them
writing,
and
and in
what it's
any
saying.
one
Yeah.
scene you could have those moments where it's like, okay, these characters are better liked, and it's almost maybe like this internal competition between, these vacation friends and the rest of the family, and to have the bride and groom sort of trying to prove themselves. But then there are other scenes where the bride and groom are on the same side as the family, and are like, yeah, we get it, these people are out there and totally out to lunch. So it's never completely sort of consistent in terms of its character story and its arcs. And then also in the third act, it interjects, this unearned emotion where you're supposed to really
Yeah.
care for everybody, at least the four main characters, and find sort of, again, this additional depth to who they are
And it
as
all comes
people.
way too quickly, even though the movie is overlong and the emotional stuff isn't earned. Going back to the dated humor, there's a drug sequence that feels like it's ripped from, you know,
It
like
almost
100
looks like
different movies.
the
And
a scene or a clip from the music video for D12's Purple Hills, is
yeah,
or
Purple
Pills,
Pills.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Um
Hills was the censored version, I
version,
think.
right,
Yeah,
right. And yeah, and to your point, and when you get to that moment, because we had to stop because I had to take a call, but we were at like 45 minutes,
and
and
we
there
saw
was
that there was like 52 left.
yeah, and that's where, like, the film really does start to weigh on you a little bit. And I
Yeah,
think I would be even more generous to it if it was a clean and quick 85, where this just goes on and on and on, to the point where, even though it's still not a long movie, but it feels longer because it is so predictable and boring. And yeah, I laughed at times, but I laughed more so at how just idiotic and dumb the
yeah,
jokes were, in terms of stretching a sight gag, or coming back to something. And it just
yeah.
felt, again, like by the time you're finished with this movie, you're like Emily and Marcus, and you just want to never see these people
Yeah,
again.
it definitely overstayed its welcome, just like they did,
Yeah,
right?
and you mentioned
Like,
the Waffle House stuff, which I think is great product placement for them. And then also
made me want to go to a Waffle House, and I haven't been to one since my family took a cross country trip to Florida. We stopped at a Waffle House, I think, which was 10 plus years
I've
ago,
never
maybe. I
had
don't
the
know.
steaks there. I've never been either. I've been to an IHOP, but I've never been
Yeah.
to a Waffle House. But the other thing that I think also is quickly worth noting is how bad the green screen
Oh,
is
right.
at the beginning of the movie. There's like this main kind of like cliff sequence in
Like Pride
particular,
Rock. See,
and you're just looking at it and you're just like, if this was made even in the early 2000s, it would be bad. But even
yeah,
now,
it
especially
stands out really,
with
really
Disney
poorly.
money, you think that they would want to, like, maybe touch
Oh,
that
they
up a
weren't
little
putting
bit.
any extra money into this, dude. They inherited this and they were like, all right, where are we putting this? Because yeah, there's a sequence that multiple times takes place at this cliff, where they go cliff jumping and their Mexican marriage happens. And yeah, it's so poorly done. Like you can tell the cliff is built on a soundstage, and then you can just tell everything around them is green screened. And there's a couple like egregious moments that are just like, not even when they're standing and it's facing the one way. It's like when they're walking back into the cave and you see like the horizon with the water. It just looks so bad. And then, and then, I mean, all the stuff at the resort, I mean, you don't get much of it. It's just that montage through the cities. And even that, it goes by so quickly that I don't know. It's that nothing really feels super well done in it. It's just I didn't have an awful time. I laughed a few times throughout, like you said, but mostly I was kind of laughing at the movie, not with it. And I just ultimately found it super forgettable. I don't think that it's going to be the worst decision if you throw it on, if it's on a streaming service. But I agree with you that it does feel like something that probably should have been made 20 years ago.
Yeah, it overstays its welcome, but if you're going to watch it, it does make sense to watch it on a streaming service like Disney
Yeah,
Plus
I totally
Star.
understand why they just dumped it on streaming. Like,
Yeah, like it almost feels like the equivalent of like if Adam Sandler were to do sort of a makeshift
mhm,
comedy over at Netflix, he
yeah,
would want to spend some time in, Mexico or,
a nice resort.
resort
Yeah,
somewhere. And then like, I mean, obviously, as we've been talking about, the wedding stuff takes place in Atlanta.
and
Um,
most of the movie takes
like,
place at this wedding.
yeah, yeah. And so a lot of the advertising for this film is mostly focused on the
The
stuff in
vacation.
Mexico and not the wedding nuptials and things like that, which again kind of plays into a treasure trove of cliches and tropes that you've seen time and time again in sort of comedy scenarios where the elites are pitted against the populist crowd, and sort of they come together at the end, and they find they can put aside their differences and find something, a common ground. And that's ultimately where it goes. And the emotional kind of beats in those final scenes, and especially with Marcus, and sort of a big reveal with him being having been previously married and looked down upon for that, and why he ended up separating from his first wife. It's like it's something that you think that these people would have had conversations about beforehand with
Oh yeah,
families and friends.
I
And
already forget why. That's
yeah,
how
but like
much
to
is
just
like,
come up like at the
yeah.
wedding in terms of like, oh, this is why I was previously married. Like you think that he
Hmm.
might have had that conversation with his
The
future father
father-in-law
and,
and
and
stuff like, yeah,
mother-in-law.
yeah, yeah. No, I feel that. I'm gonna give the movie a 2.5 out of 5.
I'm gonna give it a 2 out of 5.
Totally fair, totally fair. Thank you all for listening and watching. If you're watching on YouTube, we are Untitled. We do movie reviews, podcasts, conversations weekly. If you're just listening for the first time, and if you're a longtime listener, thank you so much. We have many other reviews that you guys can check out right now. We just started doing video versions, so on YouTube right now. We have reviews for Shang-Chi and Candyman that you guys can go check out with. But on our podcast version, which you can subscribe to on podcast services everywhere, we have reviews up right now for The Night House, Paw Patrol, Marvel Studios' What If, the 3 episodes that are available right now, Vivo, Annette, Free Guy, Suicide Squad, The Suicide Squad, The Green Knight, and many, many more. We have another show called the Untitled Movie Podcast that you guys can check out on YouTube or podcast services as well. Our 100th episode just went up where we talk about Flamin' Hot Cheetos mac and cheese, the origins of the Untitled Movie Podcast and Untitled in general. We also have a trailer reaction for Spider-Man No Way Home that's on YouTube and on the Untitled Movie Conversations podcast channel. So we're everywhere. And if that's too complicated, you can just head over to Letterboxd. Our HQ is Untitled_movies, and you can kind of get a one-stop shop of everything we do. All the links to our social channels, all of our reviews, the YouTube videos, everything's over there. So your best bet is to just head over to Letterboxd Untitled_movies, and you can get everything there. As always, my name is Matt Rorabeck. You can find more of my work around the internet, but mostly right here on Untitled. And you can follow me on all those social medias at Matt Rorabeck.
And I'm Eric Marchen. You can find more of my video reviews at rogerstv.com/cinemascene and on the social medias at EM6211.
Until next time.
Bring Waffle House to Canada. Bring Waffle House to Canada.